And now, I call on the representative of B'nai Brith Canada to bring greetings.
Hi, I'm Sam Goldstein. For those who don't know me, I'm a bencher at the Law Society of Ontario, but I speak to you this evening in my role as a Director of Legal Affairs for B'nai Brith Canada. Even though I've been in this role for B'nai Brith for only about a month and on a part-time basis, I've already had to deal with numerous litigation files dealing with anti-Semitism across Ontario. I should not be surprised. Yesterday, B'nai Brith released its hate audit, and as mentioned by Richard, anti-Semitism is alive and well across Canada. That fact will not be a surprise to members of the Jewish community attending this event. In light of this weekend's Hate Fest in downtown Toronto, where the gathered crowd cheered speakers who promised that the recent terrorist attacks in Israel that killed a dozen people last week during Passover and Easter would continue, not just in Israel, but across the world. The fact that that was said in downtown Toronto without comment or criticism by the media or by most of our elected leaders goes to show how normalized anti-Semitism has become. It is commonplace to see placards at any protest equating Zionism with racism or Nazism or declaring Israel an apartheid state. B'nai Brith's anti-Semitism audit also reveals that anti-Semitism is not a problem exclusive to the ethno-nationalism of the right, but increasingly is a problem of the progressive humanistic left. And that brings me to this evening's topic about the antecedents of Nazism. We need to remember that Nazism in its time was seen by many who had lost faith in liberal democracy as a progressive movement. Hitler did not come to power by the bullet, but by the ballot. The German people who had given the world Goethe and Bach willingly became Nazis. Professionals willingly took out memberships in the Nazi Party. Doctors, journalists, lawyers. It is a little-known fact that the Nuremberg trials included a separate trial for those lawyers and judges most responsible for writing the rules of the final solution. It should also be remembered the Third Reich was not a lawless society, but governed by the rule of law. To be sure, tonight's topic is not just about a discussion about history, but about society today. Thank you. Treasurer?
Yom HaShoah is a Hebrew word meaning a...
Sorry about that. I'd now like to introduce a pre-recorded testimony from Max Eisen, a Holocaust survivor, educator, and author of By Chance Alone. Mr. Eisen graciously offered his time to share thoughts with us in a pre-recording that took place 2 weeks ago. We will shortly view segments of that recording. I had the absolute honor, on behalf of the Law Society, to bestow an LLD, or an honorary doctorate, to Mr. Eisen in recognition of his outstanding achievements to the rule of law and the cause of justice. In November 2020, during that LLD virtual ceremony, Mr. Eisen said to us in part, "As legal professionals, lawyers, and paralegals, you have chosen to pursue justice and to preserve the rights and dignity of the clients whom you represent. I commend you for this dedication and implore you to always remember the important responsibility you have in the pursuit of justice. Of course, you have the skills and tools necessary to build your professional careers and enhance your reputations in a fulfilling and meaningful way. We are reminded by somber occasions like this one today that we must use those skills to build a better world for future generations. In an age of rising hate crimes, as have been noted already today, in that age of rising hate crimes, polarization, and inequality, each one of us must be part of the solution to these issues. I now have the distinguished honor to present to you Max Eisen.
Yom HaShoah is a Hebrew word meaning a catastrophe. It is also called the Holocaust, which is a combination of two Greek words meaning wholly consumed by fire. It has become very common. It's used now in all kinds of disasters, unfortunately, that happen to people. That terrible event was truly a catastrophe for European Jewry, continental European Jewry. And I tell this story, and I've been telling my story in Canada for 32 years. And to me, this is not a story. I'm living it over and over again. What my eyes have seen, the brain cannot comprehend. Remember the pictures of SS brown shirts standing in front of Jewish stores and painting on the plate glass windows? Kauf nicht von Juden, do not buy from Jews. Boycott Jewish stores. And that was a far-reaching boycott. It's to boycott every Jew that was a teacher in a school, professor that were teaching in university, Jews that had large industrial complexes. There were rich Jews, of course. There were middle-class Jews, there were poor Jews. They entered their homes, the Gestapo, took pictures of their artwork, and they said, we're coming back in a month. Make sure that those pictures are on the wall. The businesses that were confiscated without any compensation, so they became people couldn't earn a living. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't go to a restaurant. Jews couldn't own a pet. Hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of things that the Jews were not allowed to do. They could only sit on a park bench if it was marked for Jews. So this was the boycott. The next was divestment. They were divested of all their properties, factories. And the third item was sanctions. Thousands of Jews were bundled up, put on trains and sent to concentration camps. They're called Buchenwald, Dachau, Sachsenhausen. This was pre-World War II. Little did we know that in Hungary, Eichmann arrived on March the 15th to organize the deportation of Hungarian Jews to their death. And early morning, there's a bang on our gate. Farkas is barking his head off. Seconds later, the door to our bedroom is kicked in. Two gendarmes are yelling and screaming. This was truly a rude awakening. Yelling and screaming, you have 2 minutes to pack a bundle. Can you imagine? Do you think that they need to show you a warrant? No. Jews don't need a warrant. Here's my mother grabbing a baby Judith was about 8.5 months old, and she's telling us to put on layers of clothing. My father said, "Put your winter boots on." And he ran into the quarters of my grandparents. Can you imagine the turmoil? What's hitting us? What's happening? I had a big stamp collection. My mother said, "Forget it." We were hauled out from our home the first morning of Passover, guarded by two gendarmes, Hungarian gendarmes. They have a big black felt with red rooster tail feathers and the big gun with a 2-foot bayonet. Only killers were taken through the town like that. Here I am being guarded by these, and everybody is looking at you. Can you imagine? Like you've killed people. And 500 Jews were assembled in the school. We spent the second night of Passover in the school on the floor. It was a terrible night. Imagine old people, babies, screaming. People are afraid. What's happening? What hit us? And we are still in our town. So when I came back a year later, we had a neighbor whose name was Ili Klinker. He was a good friend of my mother. I forgot to mention that when these gendarmes were yelling and screaming in our home, Ili Klinker came running in. Her husband was an official in town. And the gendarmes were yelling at her, "Get out of here, this is not your business." But she was a powerful lady, and she stood her ground. I will never forget this. She said to my mother, "Ethel, where are you taking this baby? Why don't you leave the baby with me?" I will never forget this. Can you imagine a mother being asked to leave her baby? We didn't know. As she left my baby sister, it's a possibility she could have survived. From my extended family, 80 people, 2 of my cousins and myself survived. For the Island family and the hundreds of thousands, this truly was our last supper. And that event is coming up on Friday. So whenever this, in Hebrew we call Passover Pesach, all these memories come back. But for me, this is another story. This is real life. We wound up in a brickyard with 30,000 Jews near a main railroad where transports will be easy. They're loaded into cattle cars. 3 nights and days we were in a cattle car. Arrived in Birkenau, Auschwitz. It was a terrible journey. We didn't know where we were. The door of the cattle car was open. The lights flooded in. And there was a selection. It took seconds. My mother, with a baby in her arm, my 2 brothers, my grandparents, my aunts, they were told to go to the left for disinfection. My father, uncle, and I were selected for slave labor. And I became a slave laborer. I had a striped jacket, the pants, and a cap. I was lucky to have my boots. How do you survive? How do you get acclimatized? Be a slave laborer, living on 300 calories, doing hard labor, 10 to 12 hours a day. You have no water to drink. Auschwitz was built in the worst climatic area in Europe, between 2 rivers, the Vistula and the Sola River and swamps. And we were draining swamps, but we had no water to drink. Those that drank the swamp water died from dysentery. I was lucky to have my father and uncle with me for 2 months. Imagine a 200-calorie diet. Your body is fast disappearing. You have no underwear. You have no socks. You have no toilet paper, toothbrush. How do you work without all those tools? Well, if you don't work, you succumb. I had to use all my tools. I was very lucky that my father and uncle were there. They were selected out in July 1944. I only had seconds to say goodbye to them. My father gave me a blessing, and he told me that if I managed to survive, I must tell the world what happened. There. January 12, 1945, we were taken on a death march. There was a rolling barrage. We could hear artillery from the east. Auschwitz was winding down. They were burning millions and millions of documentation. They didn't want to leave anything behind. You see, everybody that had a tattooed number, the killers kept the record. They had punch cards. Those that had tattooed numbers. And we were on a death march for 13 days. After 4 days of walking day and night without a crumb of food, can you imagine in this bitter cold in January, you're back from frostbite, you're soaking wet from exertion. And after 4 days, we're loading to open flat cars that have in Austria and Mauthausen. What a journey. 13 days. And after 4 days in Mauthausen, back into a cattle car, wound up in a camp in Austria called Melk on the Danube. And the early April, we're being moved from Melk, again on the Danube, in river barges, to Linz, after 3 days walk, up to the Alpine Mountains. I wound up in a camp called Ebensee. Beautiful country. Ebensee is a lake, and the Alp Mountains come right into the lake. And here, we were dying by the thousands because about 3 or 4 weeks before, the Reich was finished. We knew that. They simply threw away the key to the camp. They didn't feed us our 300 calories. People were dying from typhus. And in the last moment, I was in my lower bunk. It's 5 people. 2 on each side of me were dead. And I had very high fever. And somebody shuffled in his wooden clogs on the cement floor. He said that the SS guards are no longer in the town. And I didn't know what I was dreaming. You know, when you're in that stage, your life is leaving and you have to, and I kept thinking, could this be true? And I said, I gotta make a move. I dragged myself out. I was in front of the barrack and the guard tower was empty. Can you imagine that feeling? Not seeing that bucket helmet with the SS runes or the machine gun. I said, is this possible? Seconds later, the gate came flying in. And the big tank was coming through. It had a white star on it. And black soldiers were sitting on the turret. I will never forget that moment. They were in total shock. They've seen a scenario that they've never seen before. This was a crack tank unit called the 761st Black Panther Tank Battalion. They were brought by General Patton from the States. They went through the Battle of the Bulge. This was the first camp they liberated. The war still went on for 2 more days. I had to make my way home. You know, the toughest thing was to come back. How do you pick up the pieces? Well, I sort of told you part of my story of what happened. I wound up in a hospital, eventually in an orphanage. I arrived in Canada in 1949. I'll be forever grateful to this country for giving me an opportunity to start a new life and a family. So here I am today, telling you this story. You see, if we will not learn from the past, we're going to repeat the same mistakes. This is where we're heading. I've been a speaker for 32 years, and I see this poison coming up in schools and universities. Is this Canada? The swastika simply walked in here. 54,000 Canadians died fighting this Nazi scourge that buried in France and Belgium. They'll be turning over in their grave when they see what's going on here today. And yes, we are very concerned. We Jews are always the first to get it. But you need to remember, we are the first, but we're not the last. And if you don't take heed, it can happen here. Swastikas are being spray painted on synagogues, on cemeteries. In this country, where we came here from all corners of the world to have a safe life, we Jews, we didn't bring any hatred. We left it behind. Because if you carry this hatred, you cannot be a normal person. I wish you all the best. And be strong and of good courage. Thank you.
Now we'll move to the panel discussion, and I'll call on Dr. Carson Phillips.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Carson Phillips, and I'm the Managing Director of the Sarah Chaim Neuberger Holocaust Education Center at UJA Federation of Greater Toronto. And I'm also the moderator for this evening's panel discussion. And I'd like to extend my own thanks to the audience this evening for joining us. There are, I'm told, over 1,300 attendees with us from across the province. First, I'll provide my own few brief opening remarks, and then I'll go over a few housekeeping notes before introducing our esteemed panel of speakers this evening. Between 1933 and 1938, the National Socialist regime in Germany enacted over 400 anti-Semitic laws that limited every facet of Jewish life. One of the first laws enacted was in April of 1933, and it was the law for the restoration of the professional civil service that ordered that Jews were no longer allowed to work in that field. This was quickly followed by a succession of exclusionary laws that removed Jewish participation from all segments of German society. These laws left German Jews impoverished and, in effect, removed them from the civic, professional, and cultural landscape of the country that they called home. German Jewish academic and World War I veteran Victor Klemperer recorded these happenings from their very beginnings in 1933 through to the end of the war. Married to a non-Jewish German, he was spared deportation, and his diaries provide us with some of the first first-hand accounts of the gradual corrosion of Jewish life. After the announcement of the law forbidding Jews to work in the civil service, Klemperer wrote in his diary, "The pressure I am under is greater than during the war. And for the first time in my life, I feel political hatred for a group, as I did not during the war. It was a deadly hatred. In the war, I was subject to military law, but subject to law nevertheless. Now, I am at the mercy of an arbitrary power." Klemperer's diaries have become an iconic source for understanding how these Nazi laws impacted every aspect of Jewish life in Germany. Today, more than 75 years since the end of the Second World War, these events hold meaning for all of us. They remind us how the institutions of a democratic society can effectively be dismantled. They speak to the type of society we want to build and to nurture. And they remind us of the enormous impact that all branches of the judiciary system and its members had in legally enabling the Holocaust. And that's a topic that our panelists will delve into in some detail this evening. A couple of housekeeping notes. First, as the treasurer referenced in her remarks, this program has been accredited with 1 hour and 45 minutes of EDI professionalism content. We welcome questions from the audience and would encourage you to submit them using the Submit Your Question function embedded in the webcasting platform throughout the course of the program. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Please indicate, where possible, whether your question is directed at any specific panel member. And now it gives me great honor to introduce this evening's esteemed panel of speakers. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to keep their introductions to a minimum. First, Aryeh Barnea is an attorney and lecturer at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Faculty of Law. Aryeh was born in Hadera, Israel, and at the age of 18, he won the Yad Vashem Award for an outstanding final paper on the Adolf Eichmann trial. He served in the Israeli Defense Force as a fighter and a post commander, and later as a military correspondent. He became a lawyer after having completed his studies at the Faculty of Law at Hebrew University. Together with others, he established Lapid, the movement for transmitting the lessons of the Holocaust, and acted as chair for over 7 years. He's worked as a principal in a number of high schools in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and other cities in Israel. Aryeh published 2 books on the Holocaust, We Did Not Surrender, and One Fate, and the book Education on the Development of Man and Society. For the past 15 years, Aryeh has been serving as the chair of AMCHA, the Israeli Center for Psychological and Social Aid for Holocaust Survivors. Our second panelist this evening is Benjamin Carter Hett, professor of history at the City University of New York, Hunter College and Graduate Center. Benjamin was born in Rochester, New York, to a mother who was a New York City native and to a father from Kitchener, Ontario. He grew up in Edmonton but moved to Toronto to earn his JD from the University of Toronto Law School. He was licensed by the Law Society of Ontario and practiced corporate litigation for 4 years. He also graduated with a PhD from the History Department of Harvard University in 2001. Benjamin's first book, Death in the Tear Garden, was published in 2004, and it was a study of what happened in the criminal courts in Berlin in the years between 1891 and 1914, based on extensive research into court records, newspapers, novels, memoirs, and plays from that era. Other books blending German history with legal themes followed. In 2008 came Crossing Hitler, a biography of the courageous anti-Nazi lawyer Hans Litten, which was also made into a television drama and a documentary for the BBC. Crossing Hitler was followed in 2014 by The Burning the Reichstag, a historical detective story in which Benjamin set out to use stacks and stacks of recently released legal records to reconstruct what happened on that night in 1933. when the Reichstag burned, and to figure out what drove the bitter and highly political controversy about the fire for years afterwards. In the last few years, Benjamin has turned to broader themes: the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the coming of the Second World War. His widely acclaimed 2018 book, The Death of Democracy, looked at why democracy failed in Germany in the early 1930s. The Death of Democracy has now been followed by The Nazi Menace, that was in 2020, on the coming of the Second World War. Benjamin makes regular appearances as a speaker on radio, television, and podcasts, and in historical documentaries. And he's joining us this evening from New York City. And our third panelist is Kathy Lesser-Mansfield, who is a senior instructor at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law, which is located in Ohio. Kathy joined the Case Western Reserve Law School faculty in July of 2019 as executive director of the Master of Arts in Financial Integrity program and senior instructor in law. Prior to joining the faculty, she was a professor of law at Drake University Law School, served as a policy analyst with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and was a visiting professor of law at Georgetown Law School. Kathy teaches a variety of consumer, payments, and commercial law courses, is a co-author of the National Consumer Law Center's Consumer Banking and Payments Law Manual, and speaks nationally about consumer protection issues. Kathy also teaches a course called Holocaust in the Law. She's a distinguished fellow at the Consortium for the Research and Study of Holocaust in the Law at Chicago-Kent College of Law's Center for National Security and Human Rights Law. She's the composer and librettist of an opera entitled The Sparks Fly Upward that follows 3 German families in Berlin, 2 Jewish and 1 Christian, through the Holocaust, and she is founder and executive director of the Sparks Fly Upward Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating people about the Holocaust, genocide, and tolerance through presentations of sparks and ancillary activities. For more information on the Sparks Fly Upward Foundation, please refer to the poster located under the Materials tab on the webcasting platform. And so now to delve into our topic this evening, I'd like to begin our discussion with an overview of the critical role that lawyers, judges, and indeed the judiciary system played in the lead up to and during the Nazi regime. Many senior jurists in Nazi Germany had been on the bench throughout the Weimar Republic era, and some before that during the imperial regime of Kaiser Wilhelm II. However, many judges also rejected the legitimacy of the democratic Weimar Republic, since it had come about through revolution, which they considered by definition a violation of the law. What were then some of the personal and ethical struggles that lawyers and judges faced as they moved Germany from being a democracy to a dictatorship? And I'd like to invite Aryeh and then Benjamin to give us some insights into this first topic this evening.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Carson. Germany was one of the only countries in the history of the world that made an official decision to become a dictatorship after being in democracy for 15 years. And this resolution it made was stated both legally and politically inside Germany and confronting the world. No one had to conclude from other elements the new nature of Germany's politics. It was very clear. And Hitler, according to one of the first laws enacted in Germany, Nazi Germany, was Führer in the sense that he was prime minister, but he had the authority to give orders to other ministers. His resolutions did not take any majority he had to achieve inside the government. He was the legislator other laws could be enacted by the parliament that included one party alone since 1933, the Nazi Party. It was Hitler's reaction, according to his general behavior, to the resolution made years ago to outlaw the Nazi Party when he was imprisoned. And now he outlawed all other parties. I think that the basic element of the new regime, as should be in any regime, was values, ideology, and maybe we should define it. Nazism, according to the Nazi Party, and of course to the Nazi regime since 1933, had 5 elements: racism, the superiority of the Aryan race, which was led by Germany, German nation. The value, which was German and Aryan dominance, both militarily and politically, all over the world. Number 4 was a special kind of dictatorship, which was more harsh, more cruel than other types, but also was built like a pyramid. There was no council, no committee, only one Führer for every social and governmental cell. And number 5, which had to be, of course, developed for a few years, was the idea of killing all creatures of Jewish origin all over the world. That was Nazism without any connection to the term National Socialism, which they used. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aryeh. Benjamin, I wonder if you would weigh in on this for us this evening.
Sure. Thank you, Carson. Perhaps I'll make just a couple of quick points in a kind of overall way. So the first thing I would say in response to your question is that the sort of history of the rule of law in Germany in the 20s and 30s, in a way, has its own chronology, which doesn't quite map onto the political chronology of regime changes. And this is sort of on both sides of the Nazi takeover. So if you look at what was happening, especially in the courts of the Weimar Republic, from about 1930 on, so 3 years before Hitler's in power, you can see a sort of steady erosion of the quality of the rule of law, of the protection of individual freedoms and rights within the system and so on. And on sort of the other end, there's a period, a rather legally interesting period of time between, I would say, about 1933 and 1938, when the Nazis are in, but it's not like the rule of law completely goes to a kind of maximal dictatorship and repression of people in every possible way. There's a sort of weird period of some hybrid activity in those first few years where things are going downhill, but they're not going downhill all at once. Let me sort of illustrate that with an example. So one of the really famous trials that happened, probably the most famous trial that happened in the first year of Hitler's dictatorship, was the trial of 5 people accused of setting fire to the Reichstag. And the court handled that trial in a rather interesting way. The decision had to be made by a panel of judges from Germany's Supreme Court. And your question referred to, possible struggles of conscience among jurists in Nazi Germany. The way in which, in some ways, this could come out is with, in this case, judges who were without any doubt very politically conservative, but who didn't fully grasp what the Nazis were about always, and did feel some allegiance to a concept of a rule of law, however conservative, but still rule of law, not the completely arbitrary, sort of Führer power system that Aryeh was referring to. So in the Reichstag fire trial, the evidence against 4 of the defendants was absolutely ludicrous. 4 of the defendants were just a case of round up the usual suspects, find communists, and fabricate evidence in some way against them. That's what the prosecution did. And the judges saw through that and acquitted those 4 defendants. They convicted the 5th, Marinus van der Lubbe, who clearly had something to do with setting the fire, but whether he was the only person setting the fire remains in dispute all these years later. And van der Lubbe was sentenced to death under a retroactive statute imposing the death penalty on his offense, which is a clear no-no. I don't need to tell a room full of lawyers or a Zoom full of lawyers that's a clear no-no. So it's a kind of glass half empty, glass half full thing. You need to give the judges a bit of credit for the fact that at least they acquitted 4 of the defendants who were clearly not guilty and about whom the evidence was ridiculous. And Hitler was furious about this. I mean, Hitler really wanted convictions against all the defendants, which is why in the aftermath of this trial, Hitler ordered the creation of something which translates roughly as the People's Supreme Court, which was a specifically Nazi court meant to try political offenses. And that was a straight response to the fact that these judges, as right-wing as the judges on the German Supreme Court clearly were, they still weren't doing what Hitler wanted. And that's one of these little reflections of the kind of hybrid nature of the decline of the rule of law. And you eventually, of course, get to the point that Ari was talking about, or you get to the point that, Mr. Eisen was talking about in his incredibly moving remarks. You get to this point of just complete breakdown, but it happens in an interestingly gradual process.
Thank you. Benjamin, I'm wondering if you would continue a little bit and talk about the significance of the Enabling Act of 1933.
Sure. Okay. So there were actually 2 really important legal enactments in the early months of 1933, so the very early months of Hitler being in power, which together gave Hitler dictatorial powers. It's important to keep in mind, I think, that, and for many people this may be a bit counterintuitive, but when Hitler first came into office as chancellor, he was in a very weak position politically. As a chancellor of a coalition cabinet with 11 ministers in it, only 3 of whom were Nazis, and everyone assumed he was kind of penned in by establishment conservatives who would keep him in line. And then literally exactly 4 weeks after he came into office, there came the Reichstag fire, about which, as I said, there's still controversy as to who did it. I'm a partisan in this controversy, so I won't belabor the point. Anyone who's interested, read my book on the subject. But in any case, what's not controversial is that in the immediate aftermath of the fire, the Nazis blamed, the communists for the fire and passed an emergency decree, which basically tore the guts out of the Constitution, in particular, ended all individual rights and freedoms, habeas corpus and right of free speech and free assembly and that sort of thing. And there are some scholars who think that one very eminent legal scholar, the great Ernst Fraenkel, called this document the Constitution of the Third Reich. And it certainly put a lot of power in Hitler's hands. Whatever power wasn't in his hands came just about a month later, after elections had given the Nazis a plurality, but remarkably perhaps not a majority of seats in the Reichstag, in elections that were still proportional. So the popular vote, the Nazis got 43% of the popular vote, but not more than that. They wanted to put through what they called an Enabling Act, which would give all of the legislative powers of the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, to Hitler's cabinet for a period of 4 years. To do that, they needed at least a 2/3 vote in the Reichstag. They got to a 2/3 vote by a combination of means, basically by outlawing the Communist Party and preventing the communist deputies from appearing at the Reichstag, basically by intimidating and or sort of bribing most of the kind of mainstream centrist, liberal or conservative parties. And they got to a 2/3 vote. The center-left Social Democratic Party, to its undying credit, voted to a person against the enabling law. And this is quite a remarkable thing, with Nazi thugs lining the opera house where they were having this vote because the Reichstag had been burned, with Nazi thugs threatening them and sort of, smashing their fists and saying, we want the Enabling Act. And still the Social Democrats voted against. The Social Democratic leader gave a very powerful speech, looking Hitler right in the eye and saying, we're not going to vote for it. So they deserve some credit for that. But the law passed. And from that moment on, Hitler was really quite effectively a dictator with all the lawmaking powers he needed, both that had belonged to the parliament and in a sense that had belonged to the decree-making powers that had belonged to Germany's president. And from then on, he was pretty much free to do what he wanted.
Thank you, Benjamin, for this context. I think this is so important for understanding the atmosphere and the context in which these laws were being developed, certainly taking place. Kathy, I'd like to bring you in to the conversation, and I'm hoping that you would talk to us a bit about the role and the significance of the so-called people's courts in Germany.
Sure. Yeah, and I'd actually like to just tag on to Benjamin's comments that I've always thought it's really interesting that it wasn't until 1934, Hitler sort of waited until Hindenburg passed away to really consolidate everything. And we don't really have this on any of our planned questions, but it was right after then that the members of the bar took an oath to Hitler instead of an oath to the Constitution. And I think that's a really important sort of timepiece, is August of 34 when that happened. As far as the court system goes, Germany's pre-existing courts prior to the Nazi regime looked a lot like our courts in the United States. There were hierarchical, there were lower courts that were, spread throughout the country, and then there were courts of appeals, and then a German Supreme Court. And it's quite interesting that the Germans never dismantled, or the Nazi Party never dismantled, those courts during the entire reign of the Nazi regime. But instead, they created these special courts that or extraordinary courts, as they were referred to in the Nuremberg trials, that had that they then funneled a lot of the cases into these other courts. So the two that I'm not going to talk about that much are the special courts. So the special court dealt with basically political cases. So that's where the Irene Seiler case went, the Leo Katzenberger case, which was a focus of the Nuremberg jurist trial, and also an excellent movie called Nuremberg, where Judy Garland played Irene Seiler. That was created very, very early in the regime in March of 1933. So it was the first of the special courts. The next one that was developed was the hereditary health courts, which dealt with sterilization and those kinds of matters. And then the People's Court was created not until April of 1934, and the People's Court was set up to try treason cases. And the way it was set up, the deck was already stacked against defendants. It was made up of 5 judges for each division. 2 of the judges were lay judges, and 3 were appointed from the SS, the armed forces, or the Nazi Party. So you already start out with, this deck that's stacked with who's a judge. And then the chief judge, Roland Freisler, was pretty much a lunatic. He came to be known as Raving Roland. It's really interesting. I'm glad I downloaded for my lectures a recording that YouTube had of him during the 1944 trial of the individuals who tried to assassinate Hitler. And it was actually pulled off of YouTube as being offensive and anti-Semitic. In the recording, you can see him just sort of yelling at the defendants. They never get a word in edgewise. The White Rose movement, Sophie Scholl and her brother and their friend were tried in the People's Court. And actually, there's a German movie that was written off the trial transcript, which also shows the feel of the court there. So that was the court structure. And again, more and more cases got sent to those special courts and to the People's Court, which had been created, as Benjamin said, in response to some of the Reichstag fire defendants being acquitted. So a lot of cases were sent that way during the entire Nazi regime.
Great. Thank you, Kathy, for that very comprehensive overview of the court system. Ari, I'd like to turn to you for a moment, and perhaps you would discuss with us some of the legal basis for the annihilation of the Jews in Germany.
Yes. As we know, the Nazi regime was responsible for the killing and murder of some say 64 million people, maybe more, maybe less. Part of the decisions that were different than the decision to start the Second World War had to do with the killing of various groups of citizens in many countries. And the Jews was, of course, the ultimate enemy of the Aryan race of Germany. And the reason for killing the Jews, the reason in the Nazi eyes, was that the existence of the Jews subhuman group threatened the existence of the Aryan race and the German nation and the German state, and also their ability to realize the most important value in their philosophy, which was dominating the world. Therefore, they had to kill the Jews, which was much more important than winning any battle and killing any other group. As to many groups who were killed by the Nazis and their allies, Hitler's initiative or Hitler's approval was good enough in legal eyes, in the sense that Hitler, we should remember, had also a constitutional authority. He could, in fact, change the Constitution of Weimar that was never cancelled, which is a purely democratic constitution. But in the eyes of the German Nazi law, Hitler was able legally to change it, not only to cancel it overall, but to change it. And he did. For example, the existence of the right to life was changed quite a bit by Hitler. As to the Jews, some of the officials, of lawyers of the Ministry of Justice under Dr. Otto von Tierach thought that his approval was very important, but not good enough. They didn't say anything against Hitler, of course, not even in internal meetings. But they said that they, as Ministry of Justice, should do something else, because the murder of the Jews was not similar, not identical to murder of other groups in the world by the Nazis. It was more systematic, more important, more comprehensive geographically, and therefore the attention they gave to the murder of the Jews as lawyers should have been different. In the end, they convinced the minister von Tierach to go to the other minister, which was the head of the SS, who had a ministerial status since 1939, Himmler. And they negotiated with each other. And the result was signing a special contract between both ministries, justice, and the SS, police in the broadest sense, according to which Jews and other groups would be handed over by the legal system to the judgment, so to speak, of the SS. They did not have the Jews to go through the regular legal system. But since they represented a special danger to the existence of the nation, the SS, according to his or its own authorities and special methods, will take care of them. That was the contract, and eventually, I guess that those lawyers felt that they served the nation properly. We should say in this context, and from time to time, I remember the magnificent film Mephisto from the 80s, I think, in which the actor, the Austrian actor, Maria Brandauer, stated that he hated Nazism, that he was a humanist and socialist, but he used to appear before the Nazi leaders and entertain them because ich bin nur ein Schauspieler. I'm only an actor, which can be some lesson for us as lawyers. We are never just lawyers. We are always bound to the supreme level, which is morality. Not every lawyer in every function may state regarding his or her moral beliefs and change the world. But the first question is, which are the values of the regime, which are the values of the political state, and am I loyal to them? Am I willing to serve them? Am I loyal to them? And is the legal step I'm taking right now relevant to those values? That would be the question.
Great. Thank you very much, Aryeh, for this very comprehensive overview of that particular situation. We've been speaking a lot about some of these really sort of momentous moments within the judicial system, like the Enabling Act or the Reichstag Fire Decree. And I'm wondering a little bit about, as I had mentioned in my introductory remarks, some of the everyday regulations, these 400 or so anti-Semitic decrees that really start to restrict and to define Jewish life in Germany. And I'm wondering, maybe Benjamin, Aryeh, Kathy, if each of you would like to weigh in on how this took place within the legal system and what this meant for sort of a tightening noose almost around the Jews of Germany at the time.
Well, I guess I can start. I mean, the laws were, they covered the smallest things, like what park bench you could sit in and what street you could walk on, to more significant things like having to register your property, so that, the government knew if you had jewelry or paintings or whatever, which of course facilitated the seizure of those assets, to orders to turn in your pets so that they could be murdered, to orders that certain properties were to be used by Nazi officials, and so Jews were kicked out of their homes and they were put into Jew houses. So, they really covered shopping was restricted for Jews to late in the afternoon when there were no fresh vegetables or fruit of it, to the extent there were any anyway, there was nothing left. It was hard to get cigarettes. It was hard. You weren't allowed to ride on the, public transportation. So it really infiltrated every aspect of a human being's life.
Maybe I'd like to make just maybe two points on this. One kind of general and one more specific. So the one kind of general point, and this kind of ties together things that both Kathy and Aryeh have said, is that it seems to me, I've been studying this stuff for maybe 25 years, and I've come to the conclusion, maybe debatable, but nonetheless, that in some ways it's not the specific legal instruments that matter. It's what I might call the culture of the rule of law that matters. And the fact that, I think Aryeh referred to the fact that the Weimar Constitution, the democratic constitution, was never repealed. It sailed right through 12 years of Hitler's Germany. As Kathy mentioned, the court system sailed right through. As a matter of fact, the criminal code of Germany and the code of criminal procedure and the code that regulated the setup of the courts, all of those laws went back to the 1870s. And they had sailed through, Bismarckian Germany and Weimar Germany and Hitler's Germany. And by the way, they're still sailing through Germany today, more or less unchanged. But that's not to say what happened in those times legally was the same at all, because it wasn't. And this comes down to the fact that the way people thought about norms, the way lawyers thought about norms, the way lawyers thought about their obligation to norms, the way they were willing to, find the distinctions that we lawyers always know we can make about how you interpret something or define something. All of those techniques created ways to do things that wouldn't always seem to come straight out of whatever legal text you were dealing with. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that a lot of what the Nazis did was chaotic. I mean, there's a sort of stereotype of the Nazi regime as being this incredibly efficient, disciplined, organized place. And the reality couldn't have been farther from the truth. There was this sort of chaos of rulemaking going on. And sometimes they really tied themselves in knots. And I came across some interesting documents once in the German Federal Archives that reflected one of these moments where they're tying themselves in knots. In 1938, the last Jews who had still been able to practice law for a few years were kicked out of the bar. So now there's no one whom the Nazis defined as Jewish able to practice law, at least as a lawyer in Germany. And at the same time, the official German, the Law Society equivalent, basically, had come to a conclusion that it was, quote unquote, beneath the honor of a German lawyer to defend a Jewish accused person. And then as soon as those two things have happened, the courts suddenly, sort of slap their heads and say, oh, okay, we still have Jewish people being accused of crime, so who's going to defend them? Because we don't have any Jewish lawyers anymore, and the Aryan lawyers aren't supposed to do it. So what do we do? And I read through some documents where the officials are going around and around and around on this. And, sometimes in a dictatorship, you have to always say things carefully, of course, in a dictatorship. And sometimes you sort of have the feeling that some of the officials maybe have their heart in the right place, and they're trying to come up with a way to sort of have the courts function properly, but they have to say it with the vocabulary of the Nazis. And then you have other people involved in this conversation who are just absolutely spouting Nazi ideology about what should happen. And the whole thing is basically just a mess. There's this chaos. They created problems, that didn't need to be there, but their own kind of ideological dispositions and the sort of chaos of Nazi rulemaking created these situations, which then they don't quite know how to deal with.
Great. Thank you, Benjamin. We've been talking a lot about Germany and the effect of the German legal system and the laws upon Jews in Germany. And I'm wondering if anyone wants to comment upon maybe some of the allied countries or countries that allied themselves with Germany in this case, in how their legal sort of anti-Jewish laws unfolded. Sort of what comes to my mind is the situation in Hungary with the anti-Jewish laws, or even Bulgaria with some of the anti-Jewish laws, or even Italy and some of those. And I'm wondering if there's similarities, differences, or if anyone would like to sort of open that up for discussion a little bit.
Maybe within a few words. No other country made a decision to exterminate Jewish people in the world. That was pure German Nazism. Some countries, Germany's allies, made decisions to get rid of the Jews they had in the internal community, or political decisions to assist Germany. Therefore, the local legislation regarding Jews in all of those allies related to the internal Jews, local Jews, and did not mention the idea of killing every Jewish creature in the country or elsewhere. But discrimination against Jews in many fields, plus the political decision to help the Nazis in deporting Jews or in killing them inside or in the certain camps. That reflects the uniqueness of German Nazism at the time.
Just if I could just quickly pick up on that, just to follow what Ari said, I work with an educational organization that has as its kind of main principle that we're all responsible for what we do, no matter what sort of situation you're in. And I think this is a case in point, because if you look, for instance, at Italy, the country that developed a fascist regime before Germany and was Germany's ally in the war. But very interestingly, what I called a moment ago, the culture of the rule of law was very different in Italy. And in particular, the Italian judiciary actually did quite a lot to sort of subvert fascist legal dictates. You see like a lot more, in a sense, kind of covert activism in the Italian judiciary to shelter people in ways that the German judiciary conspicuously didn't do. So there's quite a different culture there. It manifested in the Italian army too, which basically refused to deport Jews from zones it was occupying to the camps when the Germans passed that order on to do so. So there's quite a different culture at work there, which kind of came out in the legal culture in some ways.
Thank you, Benjamin. I think these are really important distinctions that you're making in helping us to understand how this unfolds differently in different parts of Europe. We've had a number of questions come in, so I think maybe I'll start one of these off, and I'm going to read it directly as has come in. So it's a little bit long, but it'll get to its point. Regarding the enabling statute, when a legislature abnegates its responsibility to the rule of law, and lawyers take a personal oath to a dictator, not one to the Constitution, and the whole legal system serves the demands of that dictator, are not all legal practitioners who continued practicing in such circumstances also guilty of mass murders carried out under their laws? And if they are, why were legal practitioners not all tried at or after Nuremberg? So it's a very robust question. If maybe each of you would like to tackle parts or all of that one.
Well, I think it's important to note that jurists were tried at Nuremberg. There was a jurist's trial at Nuremberg, and some lawyers and judges were tried in subsequent trials at the local level. And even though we all know about the Nuremberg main trial, the fact is that there were many, many post-war trials all over Europe and in Germany. And in order to rejoin the bar, if I'm not mistaken, you had to go through a denazification process after the war ended. So, there was more accountability than I think most people know about. Having said that, there's a really great article that I assigned to my students by Professor David Lubin at Georgetown, which talks about how lawyers function in a legal system. And if I get a chance to talk about the Nuremberg laws, which time may prohibit, which is fine, you see that in the Supreme Court opinion interpreting that, where we sort of take the law and the facts at hand and we analyze them, and we don't take that step back to look at the morality of the laws and the facts that we're looking at. And, when do you cross that line into a completely immoral system? It's much easier to see historically than it is to see contemporaneously. And I think that's a really important point. And then I also think it's also important to note that we haven't talked about Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which is that there was kind of this big gaping hole in the Weimar Constitution that allowed for some of these political changes. It was basically an emergency decree provision that was used many, many times by Hitler's predecessors. But Hitler then basically used it as the foundation for everything that was done after the Reichstag fire decree. So it was very legalistic, even in the constitutional sense. And so it's just, I think, difficult to assess 100% moral blame if you're looking at it from the perspective of people at the time.
Okay. Benjamin or Ari, would you like to add on anything to that?
Sure. I mean, I totally agree with what Kathy said. And, I'll say something that's going to sound blindingly obvious, but sometimes the implications of it are not. Things that things that are now far in the past were once far in the future. And, one thing I think that is striking, if you study the 1920s and 1930s, is that you have to remember no one knows the Holocaust is coming. I mean, most historians would say even the Nazis don't know the Holocaust is coming at this point. It's really hard. It's so much in the furniture of our minds that it's hard to imagine a time when it wasn't. But when you're thinking about individual responsibility within a system, you have to think that these people don't know where this thing's going. That's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is that I guess with respect, I wouldn't accept the proposition that if you're working in a system that is corrupt overall, that the individual necessarily is, because there are plenty of examples of people who did brave things within the Nazi legal system. My good friend Douglas Morris, maybe some folks here will be familiar with his work. He's written a couple of terrific books about German lawyers in this era, and his recent book from about 2 years ago is a biography of Ernst Fraenkel, the noted legal scholar and political scientist, who also, less well known, worked as basically a criminal defense attorney in Germany in the 30s, between about 33 and 38. Amazingly, this guy who was Jewish under the Nazi classification of things did political trials defending political defendants in Nazi Germany and got away with it for 5 years, got some of them acquitted, and that took incredible resourcefulness and brains and incredible courage to do that. And he wasn't the only one. There were others. Douglas writes about in his book, there were others who did this. So, those were brave people doing difficult things, however corrupt the system might have been.
Great, thank you. Ari, was there anything that you wanted to add on to that particular question? If not, then what I'll do is go over to Kathy. And Kathy, you had mentioned about the Nuremberg racial laws. And so I want to pick up on that a little bit about the Nuremberg racial laws providing a legal framework for the persecution of Jews in Germany. And if you would open that up for us a little bit.
Sure. So the Nuremberg laws are called that because they were adopted in Nuremberg at a Nazi party congress. But they didn't happen until 1935, and they're very important. But as we can see from our previous discussion, they weren't by far the only thing. But the Nuremberg laws had two parts. One was called the Reich Citizenship Law, and the other was the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. And basically, the citizenship law defined who was a citizen of Germany, and the other one prohibited marriage and sexual relations outside of marriage between Germans or Aryans and Jews. The Reich Citizenship Law, well, I guess I'll talk about the other one. The Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor prohibited sexual intercourse and marriage between Jews and German nationals and marriages between Jews and German nationals. And then it allowed for later regulations. And so it wasn't until a later regulation in November that we see the first definition of who is a Jew. And it's this combination of, genetics, at least 3 grandparents who are fully Jewish by race. But then there's also a religious observance component. So if you belong to a Jewish religious community, you're considered a Jew. And the one that prohibited extramarital relations was later defined to include only sexual relations. And this question of what was meant by sexual relations actually came before the German Supreme Court. And I always think it's a rather striking opinion because it's almost a straight out statutory interpretation Supreme Court case. They could be talking about, what's a fish under some Environmental Protection Agency statute. But instead, what they're talking about is, what constitutes sexual intercourse for purposes of violating this statute, which, by the way, was punishable by death. So I think it's a important thing to look at and to understand in terms of that sort of nose to the, to the bark, that you're not actually, the Supreme Court really had a chance in that opinion to sort of back up and say, okay, we're going to look at both these Nuremberg laws and look at the basis for them and see if they have any basis in morality or in the Constitution. And instead they did this close up, this is what sexual relations mean. And now we have a definition and now we can go forward, almost as if they were talking about, breakfast, which is kind of shocking.
Indeed, thank you. We've got a few more questions coming in, so perhaps I'll start with Ari and ask you if you'd like to comment on this one. The guest writes, I assume that human rights only became the subject of any international legal organization's jurisdiction after 1945. Was the discriminatory legislation enacted by the Nazi regime the subject of any attention by the League of Nations or by any other international organization during 1933 to 1945?
Okay. The term of concept of human rights is, of course, much older than the history of Nazi Germany. And at the time, we had quite a few democratic countries. Nevertheless, the danger embedded in the Nazi initiatives was not clear to the world at the time. We know that historians still debate the question, did Hitler understand in the late 30s that in the early 40s he is going to exterminate Jewish people? I think he did, but many historians think otherwise. So the understanding in London, in Washington, in Ontario, in Jerusalem was, of course, very partial at the time. And the leaders of the Jewish people, like Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, did not believe the information regarding the killing of the Jewish people to begin with. They understood it was taking place only at late 1942, when the beginning of the murder took place in June 1941 in Russia, a year and a half earlier. As to the League of Nations and other organs, of course, they objected the existence of the dictatorship in Germany and the damage to human rights, the rights of the Jews. And we had quite a few statements in the press and on behalf of those groups. But nothing we understand today as the real nature of Nazism, like conquering the world and gas chambers and the killing of millions of citizens, especially Jews, was in the conscious of those elements, of those organizations. And the, I would say, weak response was a very important factor for Hitler in order to make the further decisions regarding the war and regarding the Jews.
If I could just pin one slight point onto that, there was actually one sort of weird, remarkable case that went to the League of Nations in 1933. And there was a kind of concept of legal human rights, in a sense, before 1933. There were things called the minorities treaties that were built into some of the legal settlements coming out of World War I. So minorities treaties were imposed by the Allies at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 on some of the new regimes emerging in Central and Eastern Europe. And there was one weird legal corner of this. So there was a minorities treaty for Poland, and like all the minorities treaties specified that people who were linguistic or ethnic minorities in various countries had to have certain rights observed by their government. And in one corner of Poland and Germany, actually, in the region known as Upper Silesia, some of the territory had been shifted by plebiscite. And so in this one corner, the minority treaty that applied to Poland also applied to a little bit of Germany in what was Upper Silesia in like southeastern Germany. So in 1933, a Jewish guy named Franz Bernheim, who got fired from his job when Nazi discriminatory laws started coming in about Jews, he actually took his case to the League of Nations and said, this violates the minorities treaty that applies to my little bit of Upper Silesia. And the League of Nations said yes. And the German government observed it. And they had to pay him some compensation. So it was an odd situation. And, you know, for a few years there, all the Nazis' discriminatory laws about Jews, including the Nuremberg laws, couldn't apply in this one little bit of Upper Silesia. The minority treaty expired in 1937, and then after that, all the Nazis' discriminatory laws could apply in Upper Silesia. But there was this weird sort of legal window for a little while when they didn't.
Ooh. That's fascinating. Thank you. Another question that's come in from our audience this evening. Do any of you perhaps see parallels between the rise of National Socialism in Germany during the 1920s and the 40s and the rise of anti-Semitism and populism? Not directed at any particular member of the panel, but if any of you would, or all of you would like to weigh in on it, that would be great.
Well, I'll start. I'm sorry, Benjamin.
No, go ahead, Kathy.
I was just going to say, I think it's important to start by saying that all democracies are at risk for going down this road. And, we'd be foolish to think that any of our democracies are not at risk. And so I think it becomes a question of what protections are there in the system and in civics education and in the kind of work we all do that serve as bulwarks against that risk. So in the United States, there's more power is more spread out than it was in the Weimar Republic. And, even the fact that, in an election year where the person who did not win the election is claiming to have won the election, the votes are counted by county and state boards of election in the United States. And so there's all kinds of things like that serve as protections against the risk. But we have to always be on the lookout for, which direction are we going? Are we heading down that road? Are we moving away from it? It's a continuum.
So my last two books have a loud subtext. My last two books deal with my book called The Death of Democracy, which deals with the rise of the Nazis, and then my book, The Nazi Menace, which deals with politics in the late 30s and the outbreak of World War II. Both of them have a loud subtext, which is precisely that there are things that are happening now in the world, including in places like the United States and Canada, which are things to worry about, I think. There are some parallels. However, I also very much agree with what Kathy said, that is not to say we're going to recapitulate the experience of Germany in the 1920s and 30s, because, I certainly, as someone I've lived roughly half my life in Canada and half my life in the United States, so these are the countries I really know something about from personal experience, and I would say the same point applies to both. Both of those democracies are large, diverse, complicated countries with democracy very, very, very baked into their culture. And I just think that ultimately there are enough antibodies to fascism in our political cultures, to use the medical analogy that is very familiar to all of us these days, that we're not going to end up like Nazi Germany. But that's not to say that complacency is appropriate there. I mean, I worry a lot about what's happening in the politics of the United States. And I guess from some of the introductory remarks, I guess I have to start worrying more about Canada now too. So there's no need for complacency at this point.
Thank you. And Ari, what about from your perspective? Do you see any parallels between the rise of Nazi socialism, National Socialism in Germany, and populism and anti-Semitism?
Yes, it is relevant for the 30s and 40s, and also in other generations, including the present. The Nazis were very specific and very extreme in presenting racism, anti-Semitism, and dictatorship as philosophies and as actual acts. But they did not invent them. And those feelings and beliefs and practice had to do with human nature. And it is still relevant. And it will always be relevant. It is possible that some people in some societies, under certain circumstances, will demonstrate hatred as far as Jews are concerned, or blacks or whatever. And there's a strong connection between this feeling that he who is not like me is bad, which means I'm good. That it is connected to the possibility of building a dictatorship even in democratic countries. We should remember that Germany in the 20s was a democratic country with no democratic heritage or experience, under very harsh circumstances, after the defeat in World War I and so on. But the very possibility that people who mastered the university with neckties, who could sing operas by heart, and then be part of dictatorship and of massacre of civilians, that was a precedent that we should be bothered by in any time to come. Which means, in my opinion, especially, that there is a special role for educators. For the teacher who enters the classroom in the morning, he should not educate against Auschwitz, but he and she should educate pro-people, human dignity, which should be the main task for educators, not numerical marks, but values.
Thank you, Ari. That's a great segue to an audience question which just came in. And I'm wondering if you would start us off again on this one. The audience member says, what are the lessons or the insights that we might apply to what's happening that we see in the world today, whether it's genocide or war, such we see in Ukraine, or persecution of the Uyghur people in China? As a legal professional and practitioner in a free and democratic society, what are the positivities that we may learn from the Holocaust to help this kind of frustration and helplessness?
Well, first of all, other disasters should not be identical to the Holocaust in order to make us relate to them. A second Holocaust has not happened yet, and maybe will never happen. And I think that had not happened before, prior to the Holocaust. But it was a special type of genocide, which had occurred. And of course, occurred after the Holocaust, up till now. I think that two renewals took place during the Holocaust. Renewals regarding human nature. Because other elements are very much similar to what we had seen in human history. Killing of hundreds of thousands, killing of millions. It had happened. Dictatorships. Until 200 years ago, there was no democracy in the world, especially not liberal democracy, maybe in ancient Athens in some sense, but not what we call democracy. The point was that we learned or may learn from the Holocaust two renewals, in my opinion, which would lead to certain practical lessons. Number one, we had not been aware of the possibility that sane people like us will take part in genocide. What we had done prior to the Holocaust was it was possible for soldiers like today, during a war, while conquering a city or a state or a region, and then they will kill civilians as well. We were aware of the possibility that insane people will do something like that, that barbarians in the jungle would do it, that terrorist organization would do it, and then criminal organization may do it. But we did not know that people like us can. I'm not saying that every person may be a Nazi, but I'm saying that inside sane society, some people are able to do it, even if earlier they don't think themselves about the possibility until the circumstances are there. Number two, as to the Jews, we knew that people can be killed, that Jews can be killed because of an anti-Semitic philosophy. This is an old wisdom. But we did not know that normal people like us may cope with such horrors in such a magnificent way. We did not know prior to the Holocaust, even they did not know, my grandfather, that when this starts, he will be able for some time to protect his family for some time, to go on praying to God, to go in the ghetto to concerts and theater when they didn't have enough food to eat and when their mother was killed yesterday. We did not know it was possible. I think it is relevant for the survivors as well, like a gentleman we just met. We did not know the same people are able to go through Auschwitz and survive and not become mentally ill and function in the normal society after the disaster and build a new family and trust people and laugh and go on living. It is a renewal as to human nature. The main thing I would like to say in this context as to practical measures has to do with two other elements which are connected to both renewals, in a sense. Number one, this is one of the basic reasons for the existence of the State of Israel. The State of Israel exists because we are patriots, like Frenchmen or Canadians or others, without any Nazi background. The French patriots loves France not because his grandmother was killed by the Nazis, but because it is his country. This is what he feels. It is relevant for us Israelis as well. But we have got a special element that has to do with the memory of the Holocaust. We understand that if we don't have our sovereignty, it is quite easier to do again what had been done some 8 years ago. Anti-Semitism in all forms exists, and we are not going to try again the danger of anti-Semitism without being able to defend ourselves. And secondly, I would like to see the State of Israel do something that the prophets told us to do, become a moral example to the world. And this has got an additional meaning after the Holocaust.
Thank you so much, Aryeh, for that. And I would like to turn to Kathy next, and then Benjamin will give you the final word as we wrap up our discussion here this evening. If perhaps you would like to, give us your thoughts, your recommendations on what lessons, specifically as lawyers, as paralegals, as people in the profession, or in public service, what can they take away from this history? Is there any sort of parting message that you would like to leave them with?
Yeah, I think it's important to always be aware of what you're doing as a lawyer. And I think we have to be very careful about saying that you should always follow your moral conscience, and we should be careful about saying that you should always follow the law. And I think that both our legal systems are built on the notion that as lawyers, we can't always follow our conscience, that sometimes we disagree with Supreme Court opinions about whether this or that is constitutional. And so it comes down to, sort of this, you have to look at the bigger picture. Is the whole regime, has it gone over that line that's hard to find? And, you have to always be thinking, where am I on that spectrum? Am I participating in a regime that's completely lost its moral authority, or do I disagree with this piece and that piece? And then I also think that, in answer to the previous question, I think there are things that lawyers can do that help address these issues. You can always volunteer your time for a cause that matters to represent, in the United States, when Trump closed the borders, and I was on a Facebook group where people were just running to the airports to represent individuals. And we didn't talk about it tonight, but a huge aspect of how Hitler was successful in annihilating Europe's Jews was that they had nowhere else to go. And so, there are things you can do. The International Criminal Court takes, people who want to take a sabbatical from their job for a year. I have friends who've served as prosecutors or defense attorneys for a year. And then it's also important to just keep talking about these things, especially now as the survivors are dying out, and, just being aware of what's going on in the world. We can't always fix everything. What's that line from the Talmud that, you can't complete the work, but neither can you refrain from it. And so I think that's what makes me feel like I'm doing my part, even though the horrific things that are happening in the world are well beyond my ability to really alter the final course of things.
So I think my colleagues have given really great and eloquent answers to this question. I don't have too much wisdom to add. Maybe I'll just say this, kind of referring back to something that I said before. people in the 1930s and 40s didn't have the precedent really that we have, or at any rate, they certainly didn't have the precedent that we have of their own experience, of what we know of their experience in the historical record. We have it. And, there are many religious and other kinds of traditions that have in them an element of, you are innocent until you have eaten of the tree of knowledge. And then once you've done that, you're not innocent, but you have knowledge. And that's where we are. We're not innocent, but we have knowledge. And however difficult it is, as Kathy put it really well, however difficult it is to navigate that line or to find the moment where your conscience should speak and not your legal obligations, at least we sort of know where things can go if they go really badly. And we know, as Ari said really well, we know what the human potentiality is because we've seen it in the historical record. So I think as lawyers or as anyone, we need to be mindful of just where things are going. As Kathy said, we need to sort of think about what we're doing. And I think maybe that's where I would leave it.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for this really stimulating conversation this evening. And I will turn it back over to the treasurer.
That was amazing. That was just amazing. Thank you so much. I learned so much and just so many things to think about and take away. I just touched by so many things about what you said. And I was trying to write them all down, and I don't know if I can put them together to wrap this up. But talking about the culture of the rule of law, when you ended up by saying, we didn't know that people could cope with such horrors in such a magnificent way, survive, build, trust, laugh, and really the renewal of human nature. And, Benjamin talking too about, examples and giving us the name Ernst Frankl, talking about, people doing brave things. Kathy talking about, all democracies being at risk, like really important messages that we need to, and we will take away with us. As has been noted, anti-Semitism, racism, they continue to exist. And as you've all encouraged us to think about the ways in which we as legal professionals can play pivotal roles in combating racism, discrimination, and hate, and ensuring that the rule of law is upheld, maintaining the independence of the bar and the judiciary so that we can defend human rights. Like, it's just so important. I can't tell you how moved I am by the profound nature of this conversation that we've had tonight. It was really remarkable. Carson, Benjamin, Aria, Kathy, thank you so much for what you've given us, for your time. To everyone who watched, the final numbers were in. We had 1,300 registrants and 900 people who signed on to watch. It will also be available for the webcast for those others who signed up and who didn't get the opportunity to be with us today. And to everyone, I say merci encore de vous être joints à nous ce soir. Miigwech. Thank you, merci, and Toda. Thank you very much for joining us.